Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another webinar in the Food Industry Executive Series. Excited to have you all here today for Supply Chain Disruptions, a health check for your operations, sponsored by Aptean. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions at all, please drop those into the questions panel and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. We will also send out a recording following the broadcast. Welcome to Aptean webcast. Supply Chain Disruptions, a health check for your operations. This webinar will cover the current state of the supply chain, food and beverage industry trends and challenges, and how digital transformation impacts your business. Our speaker today is Jack Payne, Solution Consulting Director of Food and Beverage at Aptean. Jack brings decades of experience in the food and beverage industries that give him unique perspectives and insights. And with that, I'll pass it over to you. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everyone for joining us today. As I look at my calendar and look back, it's hard for me to believe that I started seeing the first signs of the pandemic 2 years ago when my last business trip in 2020 ended on March the 6th. And now we're entering into the third year of this. And I would, from my personal perspective, I would say, the average person probably did not know what the name supply chain was or even what the word supply chain meant. And over the last 2 years, that has become a household word that everybody is concerned about. Everybody may not exactly know what it is today, but there's a lot of discussion about it. And with a lot of the current events that are happening as well, we're talking more and more about the supply chain again. So let me just take a moment and introduce you to Aptean if you're not familiar with who we are. We provide industry-specific software solutions for mission critical, and food and beverage is one of our key strategic industries that we focus on. As an organization, we're in the $500 million revenue range, 2,800 employees globally. Of that customer base, over 1,000 customers are food and beverage customers. And part of our goal as we grow is to basically be able to serve, every part of the food and beverage market, all the way from the farm through the distribution for companies that are looking for their first ERP solution that are in that $10 million range to enterprises that are over $1 billion and everything in between that. That is our goal. And, just a sharing of some of our customers. A number of the names here you may be familiar with, either globally or nationally or regionally. There are probably a number of names here you may have never heard of, dealing with, local companies as well as a lot of private label and contract manufacturing companies as well. But enough about Aptean. Let's talk about the supply chain. And we're first going to talk about the food and beverage supply chain, and then what impact the pandemic has had on the industry as well as the supply chain. What are the current industry trends and challenges that are being faced? And then we'll talk about what we see the solution to help with those challenges being digital transformation, and also looking at cloud-based solutions. And then we'll have saved time at the end for your questions and answers. So again, thanks for joining us, and let's get in and talk about the food and beverage supply chain. Very, very simplistic model that, when I'm talking to people that are not in the industry, I'll talk about this particular model. A lot of people just think, okay, I go to the grocery store, retail, buy my food, or I go to a restaurant, or maybe I'm at some event and I have food. And in the last 2 years, a lot of increase in the e-commerce or the e-tailers, so to speak, providing food. But if we look at that full supply chain, where does food start? Back at the farm with growers and packers. And this is something I've thought a lot about to try to say, is this a true statement? Everything starts at the farm. And in thinking through it, I've come up with a couple examples that may be minor exceptions to that. So when I think about minerals, primarily salt, we don't have a farm for growing salt, but we have to mine the salt, which to me is like a harvesting process. Also, early this week, I enjoyed a seafood dinner within a restaurant, which I'm pretty sure that was wild caught seafood. Again, we're not farming the seafood, even though there is a lot of seafood that's farmed, but we do have to catch it. Again, another harvesting process. So, pretty much blanket statement, all of our food source, starts at some kind of farming process. It may be a natural farm like the ocean, or a natural farm like a mine, salt mine, but we have to harvest it and gather it. And then depending upon what it is, fresh produce may go directly into the distribution channel. There may be some of that produce that goes directly to restaurants from that standpoint. But if we look at the next step for a lot of the food coming from the farm, it is the processing. It may be what we call a fresh in, fresh out produce, which typically is more occurring toward the farm versus getting into a processor or a manufacturer who's mixing multiple ingredients together, or cooking or baking. But it's typically a many to one, but there's also the one to many, where you have dairy, where you're separating milk into the cream and the skim, or you're in the slaughter process from animals, whether it's a pork or a poultry or a beef. But then it typically goes into a one to many later, but into the processing step. And then we get into the distribution part of it. Two main channels of distribution being retail distribution, going out to stores, which may be national stores or maybe regional stores, and then food service. If we look at the volume of food, and this is pre-pandemic, where is the volume of food consumed at, which I call the fork part of it? 2/3 of that was consumed by us at home. 1/3 of that was consumed by us not at home. As we start thinking about it, restaurants, everywhere from fast food to white tablecloth restaurants, but then we get into maybe going to some of the club stores or going shopping, and then maybe a deli that we might get a slice of pizza or hamburger or hot dog in, sporting events, institutions, schools, travel, hotels, airlines, and then also into the healthcare community with this. If we look at this in reverse, which I call the demand stream, again, we're bringing demand from our homes and from our restaurants and institutions back into all the way back to the farm, and there's a ripple effect, and that ripple effect occurred a couple of years ago as we started entering into the pandemic, and we all know what happened as we had closures of public establishments, and that demand changed. This is my guess, not sure, but in the beginning of the pandemic, the majority of non-home-based consumption was probably healthcare and medical institutions like hospitals. The balance of that was typically from home. Some of you may have been like me, who had to learn how to cook a little bit to survive during that period of time, and try new recipes and try to learn to cook things. But this caused a big impact in our supply chain, because I would say up until 2 years ago, we had made our supply chains very efficient. In doing so, we had made them very rigid. They were not agile. And if you were, let's say, a processor who majority of your business was going to food service, you suffered a decline. If you were a processor where maybe the majority was going into retail, you'd probably saw extra demand. And either one of those, you probably had to adjust, and you probably had to shift. And so what happened was what I refer to as the perfect storm from supply chain. Things that happened within the food and beverage industry, and events outside the food and beverage industry that impacted this. So we've already talked about the demand stream changing and how the supply chains was rigid, but also the production was fixed. So if you're making typically food service size products, whether you're making a dressing or a sauce or maybe a ketchup or something that might go into a 5-gallon container for food service, you might not have had the packaging process. So you probably didn't have the packaging supplies to now package that into consumption at home. So we had to make changes with that. We made change with our processes and equipment. Consumer buying trends changed. We started buying food to cook at home. There was also the nostalgia buying. You know, we wanted to get the comfort from some of the nostalgia food from our earlier days. We also had people filling their pantries and filling their freezer. You know, I was, guilty of that as well, as probably many of you were. And again, that kind of disrupted the demand stream of having that excess demand of different products and seeing so forth. We started looking for different sources of how we got our food. Some of this was by choice. Some of this was, we were sick and we had to rely on e-commerce to deliver that food. And I got used to it. It got very convenient for me, and that part of the market has grown. There were transportation shortages, not just in the food and beverage industry, but because we're all at home now, not going to stores. Many of us were working at home. We're trying to rapidly equip our home office with Amazon or Staples or Best Buy delivering those goods, which took up transportation capacity, which caused shortages, across all markets, but also across shortages in food and beverage. Lead times increased. I was always used to Amazon Prime and getting anything I wanted in 2 days, and sometimes those 2 days went to 3 and 4 and 5 because of those transportation shortages. Also, if you were maybe a distillery and you said, well, let's do a patriotic act and let's make hand sanitizer, or let's make cleaning supplies instead of making beverages. Also, a lot of packaging started going into medical supplies or personal protective equipment with this, which had impact into the food and beverage supply chain of not having the materials to package the goods in. We saw supplier shortages. We saw increased lead times, not only throughout the logistics side, but in terms of suppliers, and labor shortages up and down through every channel, which had a pretty big effect to us. So the earlier slide I put up about the food and beverage supply chain was a very simplistic slide, but if we look at it in a little bit more detail, it does get a little bit more complex. It's not just the farm, but we have to have suppliers who are providing products to the farm, fertilizers, maybe the seeds, maybe other products coming in. We'd have wholesalers in the process. We have to have logistics to get it to the farm. And then we have to have logistics to get the products from the farm to where they're going, where they're food processing. All different types of food processing. Also, importers of various spices or other products that went into food processing. And, not just distribution, but grocery supply, distributors, big box retail distribution chains, food service supply, and also now the e-tailers that have taken off, and all the different channels of where, as consumers, we received our food from, and most of that kind of slowed down during this time to the big box retailers and the independent grocery from this. So our supply chain was a lot more complex, and I like to use an example. A lot of times when I'm talking about food, I'm talking about traceability, or I'm talking about costing, I'm talking about the supply chain, I use a common product that I think most of us are familiar with, is frozen pizza. I'm sure all of us have probably bought a pizza in our lifetime, and probably more than one, whether it's a frozen pizza we'd buy at the grocery store, or whether it may be something that from a food service establishment who maybe has either had a fresh or a frozen pizza that we may buy a slice of. And to me, this is a real interesting study and things to look at. So if we start thinking about the supply chain for frozen pizza, a very common staple that probably a lot of us have in our freezers right now, and we start thinking about how complex is that supply chain. The first thing we need to do is just break it down into all the ingredients. And I had the pleasure yesterday of visiting with one of our customers who happens to make frozen pizzas. They are a contract manufacturer for making this for multiple companies. And as I was observing their lines yesterday, they were talking about some of the processes they do. So they actually have a facility that makes the crust as well as they do buy some crust. They produce their own pizza sauce. They're buying veggies from distribution. Um, they show me how they're slicing the pepperonis and the other meats, and they're processed depending upon how many pepperonis go into the pizza and the size, how they get those distributed. They're buying the cheese and they're shredding the cheese and using that. But if we use those as the 5 primary ingredients going into the pizza, and not even thinking about the packaging that goes into it, how many different steps or how many different nodes would there be in the supply chain? And so today, for audience participation, we'd like to get your participation into your input into how many nodes you think are in that supply chain.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, give you a couple of minutes to submit your answers. All right, just a few more seconds to get some last minute votes in. Okay, I'm going to go and close this. And Jack, it does look like the majority of participants said 25, closely followed by 40.
Okay, thank you. And of course, there's no wrong answer to this. It's everybody's opinion and everybody's experience with this. And I've tried to go through and figure this out. And just like the example yesterday that I was at, where the company is making their own pizza sauce, they are taking steps out of that supply chain. But I've said if each one of these comes from a supplier with this, I counted about 50. Again, everybody has different observations, different perspective. But if we take the dough, it's coming from flour, which has to come from the flour mill back from the wheat farm. Typically, there's yeast with the dough to make the dough rise, which goes all the way back to the sugar plantation. There's typically some salt in that dough with that. So we have a number of steps here. Pizza sauce, is going to go all the way back to the farm for the tomatoes with this. It may go to a tomato paste factory. It may go to a pizza sauce factory. There's typically different types of spices in this that are coming from different farms, depending upon what produce. In my pepperoni pizza example, I don't think any produce on it. So again, that's going to depend if you're considering produce or not, and how many different types of produce do you have, and if things like olive that may be coming from an importer. And then pepperoni, is it a all beef or an all pork pepperoni, or is it a mixture of beef and pork, as to how many steps or how many nodes this has to come from? And then the cheese, cheese is coming from milk all the way back to the dairy. So again, based upon our perspective and our thoughts, I definitely think at least 25 is a good answer. I think at least 40 is a good answer. Could be more than 50. If we start adding packaging in and we have a lot of steps, maybe it could be up to 100. But the primary example is it's not just 4 or 5 links in that supply chain. There are many, many links in that supply chain. So if I'm a producer of frozen pizza and I can't get one of these ingredients, I can't get packaging, I've had a big impact and to be able to distribute the product. And that's, one of the reasons we saw the shortages in the stores a couple of years ago and saw them for a while. One of the things that we've been doing as a company is we've been having surveys done. And our most recent survey that we did in 2021, we commissioned IDC to perform a survey in terms of the food and beverage trends and provides insights with this. And of course, in doing this, we got insight into the pandemic. They surveyed over 700 companies globally in 13 countries, 4 regions, and a good mix of size. So over a fourth of these were bigger than 100 million. Many of these were in the, less than 100 million. Many of these, the majority was in that medium size, 100 million to a billion, and then large enterprise companies, about 5% with this. And then all segments of the supply chain, the two biggest segments being the food manufacturer as well as the food distributor. So a couple of things to share with you is what impact did COVID have in your region with this? And this slide gets a little busy because each one of the different categories has responses for each of the four regions of North America, South America, EMEA, and APAC, all color-coded. And you can see the ones with transportation delays, staffing delays, demand increases, demand decreases, product mix shifting. We've already touched on those. Unreliable, unpredictable suppliers. But if we look at it globally, the top two easily across the board were transportation, delivery delays, and staffing issues. Both of these causing major disruptions to our supply chain. And then if I look at this more from a North American standpoint, in addition to those two, is demand has increased. And a lot of this was coming from people providing product for retail use with this, as well as there were some people that demand declined and had to close factories. But any of these could actually impact our supply chain. But these top three had major impact of what happened in our supply chain over the last 2 years. And then from this, we also surveyed with challenges. And the first thing is, well, what worries you? And again, our respondents could select more than one, because there may be more than one thing that keeps you up at night. That's why the percentages total more than 100%. And again, the top two is probably not a surprise to us. It's all about disruption, global disruption, pandemic. We're right now seeing geopolitical disruption, climate change type disruption, but also a disrupted marketplace in both supply and demand. Also, sustainability and consumer changes are also affecting this. But disruption is the key fear that is keeping people in the food and beverage industry awake at night, and they're concerned about what's happening over the next 5 years. And then kind of along with that, we asked, well, what do you think is going to impact the food industry the most in the next 5 years? And clear winner, so to speak, was changes in consumer demands and preferences. That has been a major part of what we've seen in the marketplace for the last 2 years. Those demands changed as our social distancing and other things that occurred when we're eating our food. We had changed a lot of our preferences and what we're doing with this. But what came out as number 3 was, how are we going to solve the problems we have, through technology and data solutions or digital transformation. Typically when you do a survey of food and beverage companies, usually number 1, if it's not number 1, number 2 is cost. And cost is still going to be a bit major impact, but it's now listed down pretty clear at number 4, none that top 1 or 2 with that, and having the technology to solve the challenges of the future with this. And so that takes us into talking about digital transformation, to look at ways that we can improve our supply chain. We can help us with those disruptions, and maybe even help try to predict some of those disruptions. And so when we talk about digital transformation, the first time I heard this term a few years ago, my initial thought was, okay, this is pretty cool. We can just plug in a lot of digital sensors, and then we have all this data and all this information. But it's really not about that. It's the digital part of it, is the technology of what we're going to do to transform the business. And yes, we need a technology backbone to be able to transform the business, but we need to look at our business processes and look at changing those processes, as well as potential cultural and organizational changes. So for example, your organization may be today where there may be a person, their role is to gather information and create reports. And depending upon what level of technology they have, that person may spend 75 or 80% of their time just gathering the data and compiling the data. And the balance of the time they may spend in creating the reports from the data. So let's say that I'm doing that all week this week, and tomorrow on Friday, I have now created a report that told me what happened last week. Well, that's not actionable information. Data is just like food. Data has a shelf life, and we're all familiar with shelf life and how that affects us. So if we're looking at data tomorrow from what happened last week, we really can't do a lot about it. So that person's role may change as we go through this digital transformation journey to how do we collect the data in the system, and how do we have the system create those reports for us so that we can then analyze that information, and we can now have actionable information, actionable alerts that we can take action on today, not just a report that we can look at next week with this. So digital transformation is a journey. You know, typically it's thought that journey is at least a 2 or 3 year journey. I kind of equate it to continuous improvement, where you make significant strides along the way, significant improvements, but there's always room for improvement in the end. So I think once you start the process, you are going to reach a certain point, destination, but there's also going to be additional destinations, additional journeys that you may want to take as part of the process. So poll question number 2 is we'd like to hear from you is, where are you in your organization in your digital transformation journey? What stage do you think you're at?
All right, we'll keep this open for about a minute or so while you submit your answers. All right, about 10 more seconds for people to put in their last minute answers. Okay. So it looks like most people are well underway, just getting started, or not started, or delayed.
Okay, thank you. And this is something that I'm very encouraged about, the results that we've seen from the summer of 2020 into the fall of 2021. That a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago now, in 2020, what we had seen was over 10% of the people had either not started the digital transformation journey or were not planning to take the journey. And we were seeing less than 5% of the people that said that they had made that journey and completed that journey. So in the 12 to 14 months after that first survey, a lot of progress. Very few people say they have not started it or they're not planning to start it. And we've seen that number from less than 5% grow now to almost 25%, feel like they've completed that journey. And then another third of the people saying they're still on the journey, but they've gone through the journey enough that they're getting good data, they're taking benefit from it, and they're seeing improvement within the company. So that's totaling over 50% of companies are seeing benefits from this. So I'm very encouraged about what's happened with this. Another area that we've surveyed was, how did the COVID or how did the pandemic affect you in your digital transformation process? And you know, again, this is broken down by a different region, which gets a little busy in looking at it. But the key winner, the key thing on this is across the board globally, there we've seen more companies accelerating the digital transformation journey than having to slow down the digital transformation journey with this. And the biggest increase was in South America, with over 70% have increased that digital transformation journey. And in North America, that number has been almost close to 50%, with about a third of those staying at the same pace they were at, which gives us, 20% or so had to slow down that journey. So I think this is, again, very encouraging that companies are seeing joining that digital transformation journey is a way to help with the challenges the pandemic has caused, with a number of those challenges being around the supply chain. So let's take a few minutes and talk about what is digital transformation and what are some of the results that we see from digital transformation. And I feel that there are three major components in the foundation of your digital transformation. The first is your business system. Most of us, or most of you, probably have a business system. In most cases, that's going to be your ERP, your enterprise resource planning system. That is your system of record with this. And so this is typically something that you will need to, if you do have an ERP system, is to review that system to see if it is capable to go on that digital transformation journey with you. Does it need to be upgraded to be able to go on that journey? Would it make sense to, if you're on premise, to move to the cloud? What benefits would you get with that? Or do you need to replace it if for some reason it can't take that journey with you? So that's kind of the first step, or the first piece of that, as your system of record. And then the second part of it is collecting the data. Instead of writing the information down on a piece of paper and then having that data filed away in a filing cabinet, or maybe entered into a spreadsheet, or maybe entered into the system, how do we collect that data real time, paperless, and have it go into our business system? One of the first ways of doing this is through barcoding. Most food and beverage companies are doing this today. In the past couple of weeks, kind of interesting, I visited a food and beverage company that was looking for an ERP system. They were already doing barcoding. They had a standalone barcoding inventory system, but not an ERP system. I also visited a company that had a fairly mature, robust ERP system, but they had not been doing barcoding first. So you really need both. Barcoding is, I'm going to say, the first step, being real-time and paperless. But then the other things, whether it's hooking into PLCs that you may have, or having sensors to track data that's occurring with this. So we want to record this information real time, so we're not reading last week's results tomorrow. We want to be understanding those results. And to me, the goal is not collecting the data. The goal is, what do we do with the data that we collect? Well, we have to collect it, and it has to be real time and accurate. But the real benefit is, how do we use that data for actionable information? We may get real-time alerts. So if we have a process as it's starting to go out of control, let's maybe say that we're packaging some type of beverage, and that beverage has a 500 milliliter package. By law, we have to have at least 500 milliliters. And so we will set the equipment, because of variations as we fill each bottle, to make sure we have 500 milliliters, but there's going to be a certain amount of giveaway typically. So we want to be able to track that. As we see that giveaway getting larger and larger before it gets out of control, we want to be able to correct it. But we also want systems to be able to provide actual information, so we can learn how to reduce that giveaway as well. And so that gives us the first part, it's the alerts. The second is really the analytics. And then we want to get into what we call predictive analytics, where the system can actually predict things for us, rather than us having to spend time analyzing information that has collected. So these are the three key components of digital transformation. A lot of others that come along with it, but to me, this is the foundation you have to start with. And the big benefit that you're going to get out of it is the efficiency from capturing the data real time, the accuracy of the data, and then being able to get alerts and analytics with the data. And as we get to analytics and actionable information, there's lots and lots of different examples. One of those is in our supply chain. And, first of all, we need to have our supply chain where it's not as rigid, where we can be more agile with that. And as we gather data, what the data can do is help us understand where there are inefficiencies within our supply chain. As I was driving home from the airport yesterday, actually in my GPS, I got a note that the route I was going to take, that there was an accident up ahead. And so that was actionable information. I was able to bypass that bottleneck and not slow me down and take an alternate route that only took a couple extra minutes versus an unknown amount of time and what looked like where I could see a half mile down the road an extremely timely delay that would have. So we want that to happen in our business systems so that we get those kind of alerts, but we want to be able to collect this information over time to see why it's occurring so we can eliminate those inefficiencies and bottlenecks. Areas that can help us with is new product development, reducing that. Consumer preferences and consumer demands are getting more and more, and we need to be able to respond to those, whether you're producing your own branded product or maybe you're a co-packer or co-manufacturer that works with your customers to get that product to market. And that, helps us produce a agile supply chain. Also, how do we make sure we make product at the cost? How do we get the efficiencies in the process to reduce that cost? Because everything we're seeing today is all the ingredients and everything going into the product, that cost is increasing. So how do we have offsets to those increases to help us either maintain or reduce our product cost, but also have to know what our cost is going to be for that product and maintain that. And actionable information, getting information about what customers are buying and what we're selling and what inventory turns we're having, getting sales history and getting maybe a demand history for market insights so that we can be very agile in our manufacturing so that we're not just always making the same products that we've always made. And then when our warehouse is full of those products, realize we've made too much. We don't want to do that. And then also as we get into looking at predictive analytics, I'm equating this to something called causal-based forecasting. I live in the Atlanta area, and we have a phenomenon that happens here whenever there is a forecast of snow. Yes, we do get snow, maybe once every 2-3 years, and maybe we get 1 inch or 2 inches. But when we get that forecast of snow, there's all of a sudden a run at the grocery store or the supermarket. And they're typically, 4 categories of foods that typically all the consumers are buying. They're typically buying the bread, the milk, the eggs, and the beer. Those shelves are completely empty if you get there a little bit too late with that. But now that, our weather forecasting system has probably gotten better than it has been over the years and more accurate. If we brought that into our demand planning process and can now forecast consumption and forecast what we need to produce based upon predicted weather events. Now, it would be very hard to have gone back 2 years because none of us have ever been through an event like the pandemic and know what all the effect is going to be, but we're learning from that. And as we see, hopefully we don't see other variants occur, but if other variants do occur, we now have some past history to know what can happen with that and how that may adjust what kind of consumer demands that we have with this. So this is just some of the areas that analytics can provide good information and actionable information and help make our supply chains more agile and help with all those disruptions within the supply chain. And these aren't the only areas that digital transformation can help us in the various areas of opportunities. We've already talked about resilient supply chain. Also as we get into Industry 5.0, 4.0 and 5.0. 5.0 is man and machine working together. And also we've talked about artificial intelligence for decision support, but a number of other areas that also can be explored as we get into traceability and food safety, which is always very key into food and beverage industries. And while this sounds good, but what are the results? What have companies seen in terms of results that have gone through this digital transformation journey? Are they, nearing that journey, they're halfway through the journey and they're getting information results back? This was another one of the survey topics. Again, the color coding on this one is not regional, but it's more about results. And so the black says, we've seen improvement and expect to see more. And the orange said, we've seen improvement, but we don't think we're getting any more from this. And then the gray says, we haven't seen improvement yet, but we expect to. And if you look at this, all categories of the business have seen improvement. Whether it's in supply chain, whether it's in maintenance, whether it's in procurement or quality of food safety, We're just adding up the black and the orange numbers. Number one is quality and food safety. Number two, followed right behind it, is supply chain. That's what we're talking about today. And also very close to supply chain is this next door neighbor, is logistics efficiency, which is very important. But all of these affect our supply chain, our inventory, and our warehousing. And as a result of being able to deliver to our customers on time, improvements in customer service, improvements in our overall equipment effectiveness, OEE, having actual information to eliminate those production bottlenecks, and having the product produced when we need to have it produced. It helps with our supply chain as well as the procurement efficiency and maintenance, being able to have the equipment available and not have unplanned downtime. All these work together to help improve our supply chain. But what kind of business results have also been received with this? And so one of the other areas that was looked at was the maturity of digital transformation in the various areas in terms of revenue, in terms of profit. So one of the three categories that was looked at was supply chain management in terms of digital transformation. And there was a direct correlation in the more mature of that digital transformation with each of these, but with supply chain management, the greater increase in revenue with this. And also from a profitability standpoint, a greater increase in the profit that we had from this. So not only do we see improvements across various departments, we see improvements to the business with this. And then the last topic to share with you before we get to our question and answer period is, well, what about the cloud? You know, how does digital transformation the cloud? And, you know, as we're talking about food, and a lot of times you go to restaurants and you'll see, you know, this pairs with this. So I have the same analogy here. Digital technology pairs very well with the cloud with this. And there are 2 points I want to share with you on this. And we won't talk a whole lot about cloud, but we'll just talk about the results of cloud and digital transformation. So one of the things that was looked at was different categories of where companies are in moving their enterprise systems to the cloud. And what we saw was that if you have moved to the cloud, that your digital transformation was more mature. And there's several reasons as to why this occurred from a technology standpoint, but typically when you're on the cloud, you typically have upgrades to that latest release. You typically are focusing on your business, you're not focusing on the infrastructure. And so that allows you to be more mature in your digital transformation efforts with that. And so all that's good, but what does that do to you, again, from a business perspective or business performance? And so there was also part of the surveys that were done was looking at the improvement that a ERP system had on the business in all the areas. And just like digital transformation, ERP does provide improvement across the board everywhere, and that's what ERP is designed to do. And if we look at the on-premise improvement, you know, that's in the 70 to high 70 range across all the different business processes and departments. What was seen with those companies that had moved to the cloud or deployed in the cloud, those results averaged about 15% overall across the board. And supply chain, you know, all the way from forecasting, you know, through managing the products, the supply and shipping to customers, significant improvements with that. So we think cloud and digital transformation pair very well together in terms of the effects and the improvements that can be on your business with this. And so just, you know, finishing up here, you know, what are our recommendations? And this is joint recommendations from IDC, who we commissioned to do the study, and then a review of this together from the recommendations they made, that we reviewed those and we did adopt those same recommendations, is that if you're not already have joined the digital transformation journey, to push to join that journey, and to be not only just push, but be aggressive to push it. We don't want to go too fast and miss steps that need to be taken, but make it very aggressive in your organization so you can be prepared for disruptions in the future, because we don't know what all those disruptions are going to be, but we can be prepared to react and be agile to those disruptions with that. And as doing part of that, look at your ERP system. If you have an ERP, if you don't have an ERP, you may be using a couple of point solutions. Look at your current state and, make sure it supports your business. It can do the things that you need to do. While an ERP is going to give you improvement across the business, it doesn't have to be in the cloud, but it does help, is the word used. You do get additional benefits from being in the cloud with this. But also make sure your processes and your supply chain is agile. This is as simple as having alternative suppliers and maybe having some more local suppliers if you're dealing with global suppliers when there are bottlenecks in the supply chain with this, but also predictive analytics. So that's why we need to join that digital transformation journey so that we get the information so that we can then get our alerts and get our analytics and move in that predictive analytics process to just help us be better in the future. So thank you for your time today. Amanda, let me turn it back over to you for our question and answer session.
Thank you, Jack. We do have some questions for you. And the first one is, how should we view our ERP system in our transformation?
So I think that is a key point, because I do believe that is the #1 foundation piece. Maybe we call that the cornerstone of our digital transformation foundation. And so I think, you need to be realistic. You may want to bring in an outside consultant, because sometimes, those other set of eyes may see things that you're not seeing. You may be used to putting information in a spreadsheet. You may be used to workarounds that you're doing, but let's make sure that we take a realistic view of, is your ERP system serving you well? Are there improvements that can be done with an ERP system, with your system? Is it still supported? Do you need to upgrade it? Do you need to replace it? Do you need to move it to the cloud? So I think all those kind of questions and all that analysis needs to be done, just like before you start out on a journey. So if I was going to do a car trip, whether it's a 200 miles or 2,000 mile car trip, I'm going to do certain basic things like, check the air in the tires, make sure I have oil in the engine, I'm not low on oil, and have a full tank of gas to start out with. And so we just need to audit and make sure we have all the right tools together. We need to do that same type of review of our ERP system before we start on that digital transformation journey.
Thank you. And the next one is, should I get my supply chain planning applications from the same company as my ERP solution?
And again, that's a great question. And I'm going to say it depends. I'm going to put a big qualifier on it. So I would recommend that, first of all, check with your ERP partner and, determine, do they have supply chain applications? If they do have supply chain applications, the two big things to look at are, do those applications meet your requirements in this? And also, are they integrated? And how do they keep those systems integrated? Are they not integrated? If they're not integrated, you could go to a different source for that. But again, there's a lot of benefit in dealing with, one partner. If you have a great working relationship with that partner, even if they're not integrated, that's something that you need to make part of your evaluation as you go through this. So I think you want to look first at your ERP partner to see what they have available to you, but not restrict yourself if they don't have the systems that meet your needs that are not integrated. To definitely take a look at what else is available. That now I would be looking for something that someone that would be similar to you and what you're doing, and maybe had the same ERP system that you had, and kind of see what kind of results they can provide as a referral account.
Okay, thank you. And the next one is, how long is the digital transformation journey?
Kim, that is a great question. The overall statistics It's typically considered to be a 2 to 3 year journey, but I think it's one of those things, kind of like you get the bug. You take your first big trip and you enjoy it so much you want to do it again. Well, I think that's what's going to happen as you go through the digital transformation process. You're going to have certain goals that you want to have, certain, I call it milestones along the way, and you're going to start seeing benefit with this. But again, I think it's a continuous improvement process that that maybe hopefully you don't ever complete it. You have made that first leg of the journey and made a lot of improvement. But 2 to 3 years is kind of considered the average. Do you have an ERP system? Do you not have an ERP system? Do you upgrade it, replace it? That could take additional time. I've got a customer I've worked with for quite a number of years, and they, now they look back at it, they say we've actually started the digital transformation journey before the term was here. We were doing some of these things in terms of collecting the information and trying to analyze the information, get actionable information and alerts. And they can go back and look at this journey that they've been on, this technology journey, and they can point out, here are various improvements we've had, and here's how it's helped the business. And they told me they've been on this journey for 8 years, but they are viewing it as a continuous improvement project. And they haven't decided how long that journey is going to last, but they plan to keep improving the business as there are new options and places to explore.
Wonderful. And the next question is, what are some of the best practices for food and beverage companies when building out the cloud strategy?
So that's something that I think there's a lot of maybe misinformation about the cloud. And when I say misinformation, there are different cloud options, so to speak. So just because you take your on-premise system and you go to a hosting provider, and now instead of having your hardware on premise, you have the infrastructure is being provided by this third-party hosting company. Yes, you've put your infrastructure in the cloud, but that's not typically what we consider to be a cloud solution. And when we talk about a cloud solution, what we're talking about is an application or applications designed for the cloud. But more than just designed for the cloud is more of a subscription type service, so that as upgrades come out, that those upgrades are applied. It doesn't mean those upgrades have to be automatic, that you come in the next day and all of a sudden you're in a new release, but upgrades come out at regular times and automatically applied when you want those upgrades applied with that, so that you are getting a service of an ERP solution, and that you have that service available to you so that you can really focus on how you use that and how you improve your business. So I really think you need to be looking at somebody who's providing a typically referred to as a subscription or a SaaS based offering, who is providing all the infrastructure, all the software for you in the cloud environment, not just taking your existing environment, which is referred to as a lift and shift, and lifting and shifting that and moving that into the cloud while getting all the benefits that a cloud-based SaaS solution provides you.
Thank you. And the final question is, what is needed to use barcode scanning?
So there needs to be, first of all, some procedures, some standards in place, some hardware, some technology. So barcode scanning has become very, very popular, and most food companies, if they're not doing it today, they want to be able to do that. It takes a culture change along the way, starting all the way with shipping, going all the way through the processes, all the way to shipping, so that when goods come in from a supplier, that it may be the supplier has a GS1 formatted label on those goods that we can scan and put those in our inventory. Typically, in more cases than not, it may not have that GS1 label, so we need to have some type of format that identifies what we have. And if it's just a quote standard barcode label, that barcode label is really a cross-reference, so to speak, to, what is the product? What is the lot number of that particular product? What status is that in? Has it been released for production or released for sales, or is it on a quality hold? Where is it located within the warehouse? So that as every activity occurs, we have the accuracy and we have the timely information. I've been, through factories before where I would, stop at an operator station and I would see where they had written down, this is the product and this was the lot number, this was the quantity that I consumed in my process. And I, more than once would ask my host to come over and I'd point to it and I says, is this a 2 or is this a 7? How does the person who's entering this know what this is? And how do we know that somebody didn't transpose a number from this? And so if it was on a lot number, we've just broken lot traceability. If it was on a quantity input, we have just gotten our inventory out of balance, as well as created incorrect variances on the products that we produced with this. So we have to have that culture and that training throughout the process. So starting with the receiving station, that we know that as we use or move goods, that we scan that for every activity that we do, that instead of writing down on a piece of paper in manufacturing, we're scanning from a bag or a container or a pallet or whatever we're consuming from. Or if it's bulk goods, bulk ingredients, we have a way to measure that. Typically, you wouldn't be using barcode with that, but maybe some type of scales or sensors to weigh that, all the way going into finished goods production and moving around the warehouse and the picking and shipping, so that we have this continuous step, continuous process all the way through with the process. Of course, we have to be Wi-Fi enabled throughout the facility to be able to do this, and we have to have the proper hardware scanners and the training of the scanners to do it, as well as an application that's very easy to use in a food environment where you, in most cases, would have gloves on. Many places it might be cold, it might be damp. So all the environmental factors, we need to take into consideration, and again, make it easy and simple to use.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Jack, for the excellent presentation. Keep an eye on your inbox for the recording of the event, and everyone have a great rest of your day.